The unlikely savior. The night was darker than usual, with low-hanging clouds smothering the moonlight. The city streets were eerily silent, save for the occasional hiss of tires on wet pavement. Devon Marshall, a scrappy 16-year-old with untamed curls and second-hand clothes, darted through the maze of alleyways like a shadow. In his arms, he cradled a tiny bundle wrapped in a tattered fleece blanket. His breaths came in shallow gasps, more from fear than exertion. The baby was fragile, too fragile. Her faint cries pierced the stillness, each one weaker than the last. Devon's heart pounded in his chest, not from running, but from the panic rising within him. The child's small chest rose and fell unevenly, her tiny hands clenched into fists against the cold night. Her skin had a sickly pallor, and every wheeze seemed like a fight for survival. "Hang in there," Devon whispered, his voice shaky as he adjusted the blanket to shield her from the damp air. Just a little further. His sneakers slapped against the pavement, kicking up small splashes of water as he emerged from the alley onto the main road. Ahead, the glowing sign of the city hospital came into view, its blue and white lights a beacon in the gloom. Devon's lips trembled, but he forced himself to keep moving. He had no other choice. As he approached the hospital's sliding glass doors, the automatic sensors whooshed them open. The stark fluorescent lighting made him squint as he stumbled inside, dripping water onto the immaculate tile floor. The scent of antiseptic and the quiet hum of machinery overwhelmed his senses, bringing with them an unwelcome wave of memories. Memories of his own childhood hospital visits, of cold stethoscopes and the muffled sobs of grown-ups. "Help!" Devon's voice cracked as he shouted. He stepped toward the reception desk, clutching the baby closer. "Please, somebody help her." Heads turned. A middle-aged security guard at the desk narrowed his eyes, his hand instinctively resting on his belt. Devon knew how he must look: disheveled, soaked, and suspicious. He could feel the weight of the guard's scrutiny, the unspoken judgment. "What's going on here?" the guard barked, taking a cautious step forward. Devon swallowed hard. "She needs help. She can't breathe right." He held the baby out slightly, his arms trembling. "Please, just help her." Before the guard could respond, a doctor emerged from a nearby hallway. Dr. Sarah Hayes was in her late 40s, her sharp green eyes framed by glasses, perched on a nose that had seen too many late nights. Her white coat flapped as she moved quickly, taking in the scene with practiced precision. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice calm but commanding as she approached Devon. She was crying, but now. Devon's words faltered as the baby let out a weak, gurgling cough. "Please, just look at her." Dr. Hayes didn't hesitate. She reached out and took the baby from Devon's trembling arms, her trained hands cradling the infant with care. "Nurses, Gurney," she called over her shoulder, her tone leaving no room for delay. A team of nurses materialized almost instantly, wheeling over a small hospital bed fitted for emergencies. Devon watched helplessly as they surrounded the baby, their voices a blur of medical jargon he didn't understand. The child's cries were barely audible now, her breaths shallow and ragged. One nurse began attaching monitors while another checked her oxygen levels. Devon felt the weight of his empty arms and stumbled backward a step, his damp hoodie clinging to his frame. The room seemed to close in around him, the sterile brightness amplifying every sound. The security guard remained nearby, his sharp eyes fixed on Devon like a hawk. "What's your connection to this baby?" the guard asked, his tone thick with suspicion. I found her," Devon stammered, his voice barely audible. He hugged himself, his wet clothes offering no comfort. "In an alley. She was wrapped in a blanket. She was just there." The guard's expression hardened. "You found her? Just like that?" "Yes." Devon's desperation bubbled to the surface. "She was alone. I couldn't just leave her." "Then why didn't you call the police?" Devon's throat tightened. His phone had been dead for days. Even if it hadn't been, he didn't trust the authorities to believe him. There wasn't time, he said finally, his voice breaking. She couldn't breathe. Dr. Hayes returned, her expression grim but focused. She handed the baby off to a nurse, who whisked her away toward the pediatric ward. "She's in critical condition," she said, addressing the team. "Possible respiratory failure. We need to run tests immediately." Her gaze shifted to Devon. "And you found her in an alley." "Yes," he whispered, "behind the old laundromat on Birch Street." Dr. Hayes's brow furrowed. "Did you see who left her there?" Devon shook his head. "No, I just heard her crying. She was so small." Dr. Hayes exchanged a glance with the security guard, her expression unreadable. "Lockdown protocol," she said quietly. The guard nodded and reached for his radio. What are you doing?" Devon asked, his voice rising with panic. "It's standard procedure in cases like this," Dr. Hayes replied, her tone firm but not unkind. "We need to ensure everyone's safety. You're not in trouble, yet." The guard's voice crackled through the hospital's intercom system. "Code yellow. Effective immediately." The announcement sent a ripple of activity through the hospital. Nurses secured doors, and security personnel began patrolling the hallways. Patients in the waiting area murmured in confusion, some casting wary glances at Devon. He felt their eyes on him like a physical weight. As Dr. Hayes walked away, Devon slumped into a nearby chair, his head in his hands. He couldn't shake the image of the baby's pale face, her tiny body fighting to survive. Had he done the right thing by bringing her here, or had he made everything worse? In the distance, the rhythmic beeping of monitors mixed with the muffled conversations of medical staff. The world around him seemed to blur as exhaustion took hold, but one thought cut through his haze of fear and doubt. He had to protect her, no matter what it cost. Secrets in the shadows. The sterile hum of fluorescent lights echoed in the quiet hallway as Devon sat alone in a plastic chair, his damp clothes clinging to his skin. The world around him felt surreal. White walls, hurried nurses, and the muffled beeping of distant monitors. His fingers twisted the frayed edges of his hoodie, his eyes fixed on the swinging doors that had swallowed Lily Rose moments ago. He couldn't stop replaying the night in his mind, every detail sharp and vivid. The alley had been colder than usual, the air thick with the metallic tang of rain-soaked concrete. Devon had been tossing trash into the dumpster when the faint, pitiful cries reached his ears. At first, he thought it was a stray cat, but as he approached the sound, his heart dropped. A baby. She had been tucked between two cardboard boxes, her tiny face red from crying, her breaths shallow. The blanket that wrapped her offered little protection from the chill, and her small fists flailed weakly. Devon had crouched down, his hands trembling as he scooped her up. She felt so light, so fragile. He didn't have time to think. His feet moved before his mind could catch up, carrying him toward the only place he knew could help. Now, in the hospital's waiting area, doubt gnawed at him. Had he done the right thing? The lockdown, the suspicion in everyone's eyes. It all felt like too much. He was just a kid from a rundown foster home, trying to survive day by day. He wasn't supposed to be a hero. A soft cough broke his thoughts. Nurse Rosalind stood a few feet away, her hands clasped in front of her scrubs. Her warm, brown eyes held a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Devon," she said gently, pulling a chair closer to sit beside him. "You've been through a lot tonight." He nodded, his throat dry. "I didn't know what else to do." She looked like she was dying. Rosalind's gaze softened, and she placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You did the right thing. But the hospital has procedures we need to follow, especially when a child is abandoned like this." "I didn't abandon her," he snapped, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. His hands balled into fists. "I found her." "I believe you," Rosalind said firmly, her touch steadying him. "But others, well, they don't know you like I do. They're scared, Devon. Situations like this make people suspicious." Devon glanced toward the security desk, where two officers whispered quietly, their eyes flicking toward him every so often. He felt like a bug under a magnifying glass. Why would anyone leave her like that? He whispered, his voice breaking. She's so small, so helpless. Rosalind sighed, leaning back in her chair. Sometimes people make impossible choices. Maybe they thought they were protecting her. Maybe they didn't have another way. Devon's jaw tightened. It's not right. No, it's not, Rosalind agreed. But you did something right. You saved her life. Their conversation was interrupted by the sudden blare of an alarm. The PA system crackled to life, and a voice announced, "Code Blue in Pediatrics. All available staff to room 4." Rosalind's face turned grim, and she shot to her feet. "That's Lily's room," she said, rushing toward the swinging doors. Devon stood too, his legs unsteady. He wanted to follow her, but the same security guard from before stepped in his path. "You can't go in there," the guard said firmly, his hand hovering near his belt. Devon's chest heaved with frustration. "I just want to know if she's okay." "You need to stay here," the guard replied, his tone brooking no argument. Devon sank back into his chair, his hands gripping the sides until his knuckles turned white. He stared at the doors, willing them to open, willing someone to come out and tell him she was fine. Inside room 4, chaos reigned. Dr. Hayes barked orders to her team, her voice steady despite the urgency. Lily Rose's tiny body convulsed as a violent cough racked her frame. Her oxygen levels had plummeted, and her chest heaved with each labored breath. "Intubation tray. Now," Hayes called, her hands already preparing the tools. Rosalind stood at her side, her movements quick and precise as she passed the necessary equipment. The team worked in tense silence, each second feeling like an eternity. Dr. Hayes inserted the tube with practiced skill, her fingers steady despite the pressure. The baby's chest rose and fell unevenly, but the monitors soon began to stabilize. A collective sigh of relief swept through the room. "She's stable for now," Hayes muttered, wiping her brow. "But we need answers. This infection is aggressive, and we're running out of time." Rosalind glanced at the baby's frail form, her heart aching. What kind of answers? "Her symptoms don't match a simple respiratory infection," Hayes said, her voice tinged with frustration. "There's something else going on, but without more information. Family history, exposure risks. We're shooting in the dark." Rosalind's mind churned as she considered the possibilities. "I'll speak to Devon again. Maybe he noticed something in the alley, something that could give us a clue." Hayes nodded. "Do it quickly. She doesn't have much time." Back in the waiting area, Devon sat hunched over, his head in his hands. His stomach churned with anxiety, the faint aroma of hospital food making him nauseous. He didn't look up when Rosalind approached. "Devon," she said softly, sitting beside him again. "I need your help." He lifted his head, his eyes red-rimmed and glassy. "What can I do?" "Think back to the alley. Did you see anything unusual? Anything that might tell us where she came from?" Devon frowned, his brow furrowing as he tried to recall every detail. There was a bag," he said slowly. "It was next to her. I didn't open it." "A bag." Rosalind's eyes lit up with hope. "What kind of bag?" "Like a diaper bag, I think. It had flowers on it." He shrugged helplessly. "I didn't think about it. I just grabbed her and ran." Rosalind placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "You did exactly what you should have, Devon. But that bag might have clues. Stay here. I'll check with security." She hurried away, leaving Devon alone once more. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling as a single thought consumed him. Who left her there? At the security desk, Rosalind explained the situation to the lead officer, who quickly reviewed the camera footage from the hospital's loading dock. The grainy video showed Devon running into the hospital, but earlier clips revealed something far more intriguing. A figure cloaked in shadows emerged from a beat-up sit-in parked near the alley. The person moved cautiously, their face obscured by a hood. They carried a bundle, Lily Rose, and a floral-patterned diaper bag. The figure hesitated, looking around nervously before placing the baby gently between the boxes. They stayed for almost a minute, the officer said, pausing the footage, almost like they didn't want to leave. Rosalind's heart clenched as she studied the scene. Can we enhance the image? The officer shook his head. Not much more we can do with this quality, but we can cross-check the vehicle with nearby traffic cameras. If we're lucky, we might get a plate. Rosalind nodded, her determination renewed. Do it. Meanwhile, in the pediatric ward, Dr. Hayes studied Lily Rose's charts, her mind racing. Time was running out, and the mysterious infection was spreading rapidly. She clenched her fists, staring at the monitor's steady beeps. We'll figure this out, she murmured, though she wasn't sure if she was speaking to Lily or herself. Through the glass, Devon watched, his reflection pale and anxious. He didn't know what lay ahead, but one thing was certain. He wouldn't leave Lily Rose's side. Not until she was safe. Not until he knew the truth. Shadows of the past. Devon stared at the flickering hospital lights, the rhythmic hum of the machines in Lily Rose's room echoing faintly down the hall. His heart felt heavy, each beat a reminder of the weight on his shoulders. He had done what he could, but it wasn't enough. The baby, her name is Lily Rose now, he reminded himself, was still fighting for her life. And now so was he, in a way. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about her health. It was bigger, darker, like a storm cloud lingering just out of sight. But why? Why had someone left her there? And why did everyone in the hospital look at him like he was the enemy? The squeak of shoes against the polished floor pulled him from his thoughts. Nurse Rosalind returned, her face set in a mixture of determination and something softer, compassion. She carried a floral-patterned diaper bag, the very one Devon had mentioned. Its once bright colors were dulled by smudges of dirt, the fabric worn at the edges. She sat beside him, placing the bag on her lap. "This might be the key," she said, her voice steady but low. "We're going to find out who left her and why." Devon glanced at the bag, then back at Rosalind. What if they were scared? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. What if they didn't have a choice? Rosalind tilted her head, studying him with that same kind, penetrating gaze she always had. "You're not just talking about Lily's mother, are you?" Devon's throat tightened, and he looked away. "I've seen it before," he admitted after a pause. "People doing desperate things. Sometimes they're just trying to survive." Rosalind nodded slowly, letting his words sink in. She didn't press him further. Instead, she reached into the bag and began pulling out its contents. A half-used can of baby formula, 3 neatly folded onesies, a small pack of diapers, and then, at the very bottom, a crumpled piece of paper. She smoothed it out carefully, her brow furrowing as she read the shaky handwriting. The note was short, but its words carried the weight of heartbreak. "To my Lily, I'm so sorry. I love you more than anything. Stay strong. This world isn't kind, but maybe you'll find someone who is. Mom." Devon felt a lump form in his throat. "She didn't want to leave her," he said, his voice trembling. "She didn't have a choice." Rosalind didn't respond immediately. Instead, she folded the note neatly and tucked it back into the bag. "This note doesn't tell us everything," she said finally, "but it tells us enough. Someone cared about Lily. Someone cared enough to make sure she was found." Devon leaned back in his chair, his hands gripping the armrests as he tried to process everything. "So, what happens now?" "We keep looking," Rosalind said firmly. "Security is already working to identify the car we saw in the footage, and until we know more, we focus on what we can control, keeping Lily alive." Inside Lily's room, Dr. Hayes was losing patience with the hospital board. She stood at the head of the baby's bed, her phone pressed to her ear as she argued with the faceless voices on the other end. "I understand the protocol," she snapped, her voice low enough not to disturb the nurses working around her. But protocol doesn't save lives. This baby needs specialized antibiotics, and we can't wait any longer." The voice on the other end was calm, almost patronizing. "Dr. Hayes, you know we have to follow procedure. We can't lift the lockdown until we're certain there's no threat to." "No threat." Hayes cut in, her grip tightening on the phone. "The only threat is to her life, and every minute we waste is another minute she doesn't have. If you want to argue liability, fine, but don't pretend this is about her safety." She ended the call with a frustrated jab at the screen, her hands shaking with anger. Turning to the nurses, she took a deep breath to steady herself. "We're running out of time," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Let's run another set of blood work and call in every resource we have. If the board won't help, we'll do this ourselves." Meanwhile, in the security office, Officer Rice was piecing together the puzzle. The footage from the alley had revealed more than just a shadowy figure. It had caught a glimpse of the car's license plate. The number was partially obscured, but it was enough to start a search. Her phone buzzed as the results came in. She opened the email, her eyes scanning the information quickly. The car was registered to a woman named Clara Reynolds, a 32-year-old who lived just a few blocks from the hospital. Rice wasted no time. She called her team, instructing them to check the address. "And be careful," she added. "We don't know what we're walking into." Devin's legs jittered as he sat in the waiting area, the tension in his body growing with every passing minute. He glanced toward the swinging doors again, his mind racing. He hated this, waiting, feeling useless. Lily was fighting for her life, and all he could do was sit there. Rosalind returned, her expression more serious now. "Devin," she said, sitting beside him once more, "I need to ask you something." He nodded, though his stomach twisted at her tone. "What?" "If someone from your past showed up needing help," she began carefully, "would you trust them?" The question caught him off guard. "What do you mean?" "Lily's mother," Rosalind said gently. "If she came back, if she explained why she left Lily, could you give her the benefit of the doubt?" Devin's jaw tightened. He thought of his own mother, a woman he hadn't seen in years. She had left him, too, not in an alley, but in a way that felt just as cold. Did he trust her? Did he forgive her? "I don't know," he admitted. "But if she's willing to help Lily, I guess it doesn't matter." Rosalind smiled faintly, her hand resting on his shoulder. "That's a good answer." At the same time, Officer Rice stood on the doorstep of a modest apartment building. The peeling paint and rusted mailbox spoke of hard times, but the faint glow of a television from one of the windows hinted at life inside. She knocked firmly, her hand steady. A woman answered, her face pale and drawn. Her eyes darted nervously to the uniform, then to the badge. She was young, with dark circles under her eyes and a frailness to her frame that suggested more than just exhaustion. "Clara Reynolds?" Rice asked. The woman nodded, her hands gripping the edge of the door. "Is this about her?" Rice didn't answer immediately. Instead, she studied the woman's face, searching for signs of guilt, fear, or something in between. "We need to talk," she said finally. As the pieces began to fall into place, Devin remained in the waiting area, unaware of the unfolding investigation. All he knew was that Lily Rose's life hung in the balance, and that for better or worse, he had become her only protector. The question that lingered in his mind, unspoken but ever present, was this: had he done enough? A mother's choice. The small apartment felt like a relic of better times. The faded wallpaper peeled at the edges, and the air carried the faint scent of mildew mixed with something sweet, like lavender, though faint and fleeting. Clara Reynolds sat stiffly on the worn couch, her hands trembling as she clutched a half-empty mug of tea. Officer Rice stood across from her, clipboard in hand, her expression unreadable but firm. Clara's eyes darted toward the door, her body language betraying her nerves. The soft glow of a lone table lamp cast long shadows across her hollow cheeks and the dark circles under her eyes. "She's alive, isn't she?" Clara asked suddenly, her voice hoarse. The question hung in the air, thick with desperation and hope. Lily, she's okay. Rice hesitated, then nodded. She's stable for now. But she's very sick. It's critical we understand what happened to her, how she ended up in that alley. Clara exhaled sharply, her body sagging into the couch as though the weight of the question had drained her. I didn't know what else to do, she whispered. I thought she'd be better off without me. Reyes's pen hovered over her clipboard, but she didn't write anything down. Instead, she leaned slightly forward, her tone softening. Why don't you start from the beginning, Clara? Help me understand. Clara took a shaky breath, her hands tightening around the mug as though it were the only thing grounding her. It wasn't supposed to be this way, she began, her voice cracking. I didn't have anyone. No family, no friends who could help. It was just me and Lily. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away quickly. I worked 2 jobs, waitressing during the day and cleaning offices at night. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep a roof over our heads. Then, about 2 months ago, I started feeling off, tired all the time, headaches that wouldn't go away. I ignored it at first, didn't have time to be sick. Clara's hand drifted to her side, absent-mindedly rubbing her ribs as though the memory of pain still lingered. But then it got worse. I'd get dizzy just standing up. One day, I collapsed at work. They took me to the hospital, and that's when I found out. She paused, her gaze dropping to the floor. Stage 3 kidney failure. They said I'd need dialysis to manage it, maybe even a transplant. But how could I afford that? I couldn't even afford a babysitter most nights. Rice's expression softened, though she kept her tone steady. You didn't tell anyone, not even your employer. Clara laughed bitterly, the sound hollow. And risk losing the only income I had. No, I couldn't. So I kept working, even when my body was falling apart. Her hands gripped the mug tighter, her knuckles turning white. Then last week, I got a notice from my landlord. Rent was going up. I was already behind, and there was no way I could catch up. I tried to hide it from Lily, tried to smile and act like everything was okay. But she's only 6 months old. She doesn't understand why Mommy can't hold her as much or why there's barely any food left in the fridge. Clara's voice cracked, and a single tear rolled down her cheek. I thought I could push through. I thought I could figure it out. But that night, something broke in me. I couldn't see a way out. I didn't want her to grow up like this, to grow up resenting me for not being enough. Ray shifted in her chair, her pen now resting on the clipboard. So you left her in the alley. Clara nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the floor. I didn't know where else to go. I thought, maybe if someone found her, they'd give her a better life. A chance at something I couldn't give her. Her voice dropped to a whisper. I stayed in the shadows until I saw that boy, Devin. I saw the way he held her, the way he ran with her like she was the most important thing in the world. I knew then that I'd done the right thing. Meanwhile, back at the hospital, Devin paced the hallway outside Lily's room, his sneakers squeaking softly against the polished floor. Nurse Rosalind stood nearby, leaning against the wall with her arms crossed. Do you think they found her? Devin asked, glancing at her nervously. Lily's mom, I mean. Rosalind hesitated, then gave a small nod. Officer Rice is very thorough. If anyone can track her down, it's her. Devin stopped pacing and leaned against the wall beside her. What if she doesn't want Lily back? Rosalind turned to him, her expression gentle but firm. Then we'll figure something out. Lily has people fighting for her now. She won't be alone. Devin nodded, though the thought didn't entirely comfort him. He couldn't help but feel connected to Lily in a way he didn't fully understand. She wasn't just some random baby he'd found. She was his responsibility now, at least in his heart. He swallowed hard, his voice trembling. I don't want her to go through what I went through. Rosalind's brow furrowed. What do you mean? Devin hesitated, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I've been in the system since I was 6. My mom, she left one day and never came back. I don't even remember her face anymore. Every foster home I went to, it was the same thing. People pretending to care, but only until the checks stopped coming." He clenched his fists, his voice growing firmer. "I don't want that for Lily. She deserves better." Rosalind placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch grounding him. "And she'll get better," she said softly, "because you didn't walk away." In the dimly lit security office, Officer Rice sat at her desk, replaying Clara's confession in her mind. Her radio crackled with updates from her team, who were cross-checking Clara's story with hospital records. So far, everything lined up. Her diagnosis, her eviction notice, even the pay stubs from her jobs. Rice sighed, running a hand through her hair. She had seen desperation before, but this felt different. Clara hadn't acted out of malice. She had acted out of love, however misguided it might have been. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen. It was a text from Rosalind. "Lily's condition worsening. Hayes is fighting the board to get her the antibiotics." Rice frowned, standing abruptly. She grabbed her coat and headed back toward the hospital. Clara's story wasn't over, not by a long shot. In Lily's room, Dr. Hayes stood over the baby's fragile form, her lips pressed into a thin line. The monitors beeped steadily, but the numbers weren't improving. Lily's tiny body trembled with each shallow breath, her pale skin glistening with sweat. "We can't wait any longer," Hayes muttered, glancing at the clock. "If the board won't approve the transfer, I'll call in the antibiotics myself." Rosalind entered the room, her face pale but determined. "Rise is on her way back," she said. She found the mother. Hayes raised an eyebrow, but didn't look away from Lily. "And?" Rosalind hesitated. "She left her because she thought it was the only way to save her." Hayes sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly. "It's never that simple, is it?" "No," Rosalind agreed softly. "But maybe now we can give Lily what she needs." As Rice arrived back at the hospital, Clara's story began to circulate among the staff. Whispers filled the hallways, about sacrifice, about desperation, and about love in its most heartbreaking form. Devin listened quietly from his spot in the waiting area, his mind racing. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine what Lily's future might look like, not just surviving, but thriving. He didn't know what that future would hold, but he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't let her face it alone. A heart divided. The hospital seemed to hum with a nervous energy. Staff moved briskly through the hallways, their conversations quiet but urgent. The air carried a weight that was almost tangible, like a storm brewing just beyond the windows. Inside Lily Rose's room, the tension was thick as Dr. Hayes studied the monitors, her sharp eyes flicking between the numbers, and the frail child fighting for each breath. Rosalind leaned against the wall, her arms crossed tightly as though she were holding herself together. She had seen crises before, emergencies where time was the enemy. But something about this case had burrowed deep into her heart. Lily wasn't just a patient. She was a symbol of everything that was fragile and precious in the world. Outside the room, Devin sat slouched in a chair, his foot tapping a restless rhythm against the floor. The diaper bag rested beside him, its floral pattern dulled by the dim lighting. He kept glancing toward the swinging doors, his heart pounding with every beep of the monitors he could hear faintly through the walls. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of purposeful footsteps. Officer Rice strode toward him, her face set with the determination of someone who had just made a difficult decision. Beside her was Clara Reynolds. Devin's eyes widened as he took her in. She looked nothing like he had imagined. Her thin frame, pale complexion, and the shadows under her eyes spoke of someone who had been through hell and back. Her hands fidgeted nervously at her sides, and she seemed to shrink under his gaze. "That's her?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Rice nodded. "This is Clara, Lily's mother." Clara's eyes darted to the diaper bag, then to the closed doors of Lily's room. "Is she?" She's fighting, Rosalind said, stepping out of the room. Her gaze softened as she looked at Clara. She's stable for now, but we need to act fast. Clara pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, her eyes brimming with tears. I didn't mean for it to get this bad, she whispered. I thought someone would find her sooner. I thought. You thought she'd be better off, Devon interrupted, his tone sharp. He stood abruptly, his hands clenched into fists. You just left her there, in an alley, like she didn't matter. Clara flinched as though he had struck her, her shoulders curling inward. You don't understand, she said, her voice barely audible. I was trying to save her. Save her? Devon's voice rose. By leaving her to die. Devon, Rosalind said gently, stepping between them. She placed a hand on his arm, grounding him. This isn't the time. Devon shook her off, his chest heaving. I'm the one who found her. I'm the one who ran through the rain, praying she'd make it. And now you show up, like you suddenly care. Clara's tears spilled over, and she sank into the nearest chair, her head in her hands. I've always cared, she choked out. Every second since the day she was born. But I was out of options. I couldn't feed her. I couldn't keep her warm. I couldn't even stay on my feet most days. She looked up, her face streaked with tears. I thought I was giving her a chance. Devon's anger faltered as he saw the raw pain in her eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, but found he didn't know what to say. Inside Lily's room, Dr. Hayes worked tirelessly, her hands moving with precision as she adjusted the oxygen flow. The infection was relentless, and Lily's small body was fighting a battle it wasn't equipped to win. Hayes glanced at the clock, her jaw tightening. The antibiotics still hadn't arrived, and time was slipping through their fingers. Rosalind stepped into the room quietly, her presence grounding Hayes for just a moment. She's here, Rosalind said softly. Hayes frowned, not taking her eyes off Lily. The mother. Rosalind nodded. She's a mess, but she's here. Hayes sighed, leaning heavily against the counter. I don't know if that's a blessing or a complication. Rosalind didn't respond. Instead, she moved to Lily's bedside, gently brushing the baby's dark curls away from her damp forehead. We need to focus on keeping her alive, she said firmly. The rest can wait. Hayes nodded, her professional mask slipping back into place. Then let's make it happen. Clara stood outside Lily's room, her hand hovering over the door handle. Her chest felt tight, as though an invisible weight pressed down on her. Devon watched her from a few feet away, his expression unreadable. She needs you, Rosalind said softly, standing beside Clara. Whatever you're afraid of, it's not bigger than what she's going through. Clara nodded, her lips trembling. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, her breath hitching as she saw her daughter. Lily looked so small, so fragile under the harsh fluorescent lights. The monitors beeped steadily, their sounds both reassuring and unnerving. "Oh, my baby," Clara whispered, tears spilling freely as she approached the crib. She reached out a hand, but hesitated, afraid to touch her. "I'm so sorry, Lily. I never wanted this." Dr. Hayes glanced up from her chart, her gaze sharp but not unkind. "If you want to help her, we need to know everything. Medical history, any illnesses you might have had during pregnancy, anything she might have been exposed to." Clara wiped her eyes, nodding. "She was born early," she said, her voice shaky. 6 weeks premature. She had some trouble breathing at first, but they said she was okay to go home after a week. "Any family history of illness?" Hayes pressed. Clara hesitated. "I don't know. I was in foster care. Never met my parents." Hayes's lips tightened, but she nodded. "That's something, at least. Anything else?" Clara shook her head. "I tried to keep her healthy. I really did." Hayes didn't respond, her focus shifting back to the monitors. Clara watched her work, her heart breaking with every beep of the machines. Outside the room, Devon sat slumped in his chair, his head in its hands. He had never felt so conflicted. Part of him wanted to hate Clara, to hold her responsible for every terrible thing that had happened to Lily. But another part of him, a quieter, softer part, couldn't ignore the pain etched into her face. Rosalind sat beside him, her presence steady and reassuring. "You don't have to figure everything out right now," she said gently. "Just take it one step at a time." Devin nodded, though his thoughts were still a whirlwind. "Do you think she really loves Lily?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I do," Rosalind said without hesitation. "But love doesn't always come with the answers." Devin let that sink in, his eyes drifting to the window of Lily's room. He couldn't shake the feeling that he and Clara were more alike than he wanted to admit. Both of them had been left behind, forced to survive in a world that didn't seem to care. But where Devin had chosen to fight, Clara had chosen to run. And yet they both found themselves here, in this moment, fighting for the same fragile life. The hospital PA system crackled, announcing the arrival of a courier. Dr. Hayes's head snapped up, and she moved quickly toward the door. The antibiotics were here. "Let's save her," she said, her voice filled with resolve. Redemption and new beginnings. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the sterile hospital corridor as Dr. Hayes rushed to meet the courier at the front desk. The man handed over the insulated package with a sense of urgency, its contents cradled like treasure. "Antibiotics. Expedited," he said, out of breath. "Thank you," Hayes replied, wasting no time. She turned on her heel and marched back toward the pediatric wing, her white coat swishing with each determined step. Inside Lily Rose's room, Clara sat beside the crib, her trembling fingers brushing her daughter's tiny hand. She barely noticed Devin standing silently by the door, his expression torn between distrust and understanding. Clara's voice was a soft whisper, words tumbling out as though they carried the weight of years. "I never wanted to leave you," she murmured to the baby. "I didn't think anyone would understand why I had to. But maybe I was wrong." Devin shifted uncomfortably, his sneakers squeaking against the floor. "You could have asked for help," he said, his tone harsher than he intended. Clara turned to face him, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. "Do you really think it's that easy?" she asked. "People like me, we're invisible. When you're drowning, no one throws you a lifeline. They just look away." Devin didn't respond immediately. He knew the feeling all too well. The system didn't care about kids like him, and it likely hadn't cared about Clara either. But he also knew what it meant to fight, to cling to hope even when it seemed like the world was against you. "You're not invisible now," he said quietly. Dr. Hayes returned moments later, her presence commanding the room. Rosalind followed closely, carrying a tray of medical supplies. The tension in the room thickened as Hayes prepared the injection, her every movement precise and deliberate. Clara stood, her hands clutched tightly together, while Devin watched from the corner, his breath held. "This will help," Hayes explained, her voice calm but urgent. "It'll take some time, but it's what she needs." Clara nodded, her eyes fixed on Lily. "Do it," she whispered. The injection was administered with practiced efficiency, the small needle seeming almost too much for Lily's fragile body. The monitors beeped steadily as the medicine began to flow through her veins. Hayes checked the readings, her lips pressed into a thin line of concentration. "She's responding," Hayes finally said, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "It's a good sign." Clara let out a shuddering breath, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered, her words directed at Hayes, Rosalind, and even Devin. But Devin remained silent, his gaze locked on Lily. Relief washed over him, but it was tinged with a sense of helplessness. He had done everything he could. And now, for the first time in years, he felt out of control. The hours that followed were a blur of cautious hope. Lily's condition began to improve, her breathing steadier and her color returning. The nurses monitored her closely, their movements efficient yet tender. Clara rarely left her daughter's side, her exhaustion overridden by a determination that came from a place deeper than strength. Devon, however, found himself pacing the hallway. He felt like a visitor in a story that wasn't his, and yet he couldn't shake the connection he felt to Lily. She was more than a child he had saved. In some strange way, she was a part of him now. Rosalind found him leaning against the wall near the vending machines, his hands shoved deep into his hoodie pockets. "You don't have to stay, you know," she said gently. "You've already done so much." Devon shook his head. "I'm not leaving." Rosalind smiled faintly. "You're a good kid, Devon." "I'm not a kid," he muttered, though there was no venom in his voice. I need to make sure she's okay." "She will be," Rosalind assured him. "And so will you." Later that evening, as the hospital began to quiet, Clara and Devon found themselves alone in Lily's room. The baby slept peacefully, her small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm that filled the silence. "I guess I should thank you," Clara said, breaking the stillness. Her voice was hesitant, as though she wasn't sure she had the right to speak. "For finding her, for bringing her here." Devon glanced at her, his expression guarded. "You don't need to thank me. I didn't do it for you." Clara flinched but nodded. "I get it. I wouldn't trust me either." There was a long pause before Devon spoke again. "Why didn't you go back for her?" Clara's eyes welled up, and she struggled to find the words. "I watched you run into the hospital," she admitted. "I saw the way you held her, like she was the most important thing in the world. And I thought, maybe she was safer with someone like you." Devon's chest tightened, a mixture of anger and understanding rising within him. "She's your daughter," he said, his voice low. "You're supposed to fight for her, no matter what." "I thought I was," Clara whispered. "But I see now that I gave up. I failed her. And I failed myself." Devon looked at Lily, her tiny fingers curled into fists. "It's not too late," he said finally. "But you have to do better." Clara nodded, her tears falling freely. "I will," she promised. "I'll never let her down again." The next morning, the sun filtered through the hospital windows, casting warm light over the room. Lily stirred in her crib, her eyes fluttering open for the first time since her ordeal began. Clara gasped, rushing to her side, and gently scooping her into her arms. "Hey, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Mommy's here." Devon watched from the doorway, a small smile tugging at his lips. He felt a strange sense of closure, though a part of him still felt tethered to the baby he had saved. Dr. Hayes entered, her face softer than usual. "She's going to make a full recovery," she said, addressing both Clara and Devon. "It'll take time, but she's strong." Clara looked at Devon, her gratitude evident in her eyes. "I couldn't have done this without you," she said. "Thank you." Devon shrugged, his hands stuffed into his pockets. "Just take care of her," he said simply. Clara nodded, holding Lily close. "I will." As Devon prepared to leave the hospital, Rosalind walked him to the entrance. "You're really something, Devon," she said with a smile. "Not everyone would have done what you did." I didn't want her to end up like me," he admitted, his voice quiet. "Alone." "She's not alone," Rosalind said. "And neither are you." Devon nodded, his heart lighter than it had been in years. He stepped outside, the cool morning air filling his lungs as he looked up at the sky. For the first time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, the world wasn't such a lonely place after all. A new chapter. Devon lingered just outside the hospital doors, the cool morning air brushing against his face. For the first time in a long while, he felt something he hadn't dared to feel: hope. As people moved in and out of the hospital around him, life continued, yet Devon stood still, caught in the moment. Behind him, the sound of approaching footsteps made him turn. Clara was standing there, Lily in her arms. The baby looked much healthier now, her cheeks rosy, her breaths steady. Clara's eyes were still tired, but there was a determination in them that hadn't been there before. "Devon," she called softly. He stopped and turned fully to face her. I wanted to say goodbye properly," Clara said, her voice wavering. and to say thank you one last time. You didn't just save her life, you saved mine, too. Devin shifted, unsure how to respond. You don't need to thank me. Just keep her safe. I will, Clara promised, her arms tightening around Lily. She stepped closer, hesitating for a moment before holding the baby out toward Devin. Would you like to say goodbye? Devin's heart skipped a beat. He reached out hesitantly, his hands trembling as he took Lily into his arms. She felt lighter than he remembered, but warm and alive. She blinked up at him with wide, curious eyes, and his chest tightened. Hey, kiddo, he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. You're gonna be okay now. Lily gurgled in response, her tiny hand reaching up to grasp his hoodie. The simple gesture brought tears to his eyes, though he blinked them away quickly. After a moment, he handed her back to Clara, his hands lingering for just a second longer than necessary. Take care of her, he said again, his voice firm. I will, Clara said, her tone equally resolute. Back inside the hospital, Nurse Rosalind stood by the nurse's station, watching the exchange through the glass doors. Dr. Hayes joined her, her arms crossed over her chest. You think they'll be okay? Hayes asked, her voice skeptical but not unkind. Rosalind smiled faintly. They've been through the worst. I think they'll find their way. Hayes nodded, though her expression remained thoughtful. It's not often we see endings like this. No, Rosalind agreed, but it's nice when we do. As Devin walked away from the hospital, the weight he had carried for so long seemed to lift. He didn't know what the future held, but for once, he felt ready to face it. The streets were alive with the sounds of morning. Buses rumbling, people chatting, the faint chirping of birds, and for the first time, Devin felt like he belonged in the world. Weeks later, Clara sat in a small but clean apartment, the sunlight streaming through the window onto Lily's crib. She had found a program through the hospital that helped single mothers in need, and while life was still hard, it was no longer impossible. She had a steady job, support from social workers, and most importantly, hope. Lily cooed from her crib, her tiny legs kicking happily. Clara reached down, picking her up and holding her close. We're going to be okay, baby girl, she whispered. We're going to be okay. Meanwhile, Devin stood in a park not far from his foster home, a basketball under one arm. A group of kids played nearby, their laughter filling the air. One of them called out to him, waving him over. You playing, Devin? The boy shouted. Devin smiled, the corners of his mouth tugging upward in a way that felt unfamiliar but good. Yeah, he called back, jogging toward the court. As the game began, the sunlight warmed his face, and for the first time in years, Devin felt something he thought he had lost forever. He felt at home. Epilogue. Threads of connection. A month later, a letter arrived at the hospital addressed to Devin, care of Nurse Rosalind. Inside was a picture of Lily, her bright smile lighting up the frame, and a note written in Clara's hand. Dear Devin, I wanted you to see how much better Lily is doing, thanks to you. I'll never forget what you did for us. You didn't just save her life. You gave us a second chance. If you ever need anything, you'll always have family with us. With all my gratitude, Clara. Devin held the picture for a long time, a rare smile breaking across his face. He tucked it carefully into his pocket, knowing he didn't need to reply. The connection they had forged, their shared bond of sacrifice and love, was something words could never capture. And with that, he walked forward, ready to face whatever came next.